When my mother looked at our wedding invitation, she laughed and said, "You're really marrying a security guard. Don't expect this family to embarrass itself." 3 weeks later, 68 invitations had been mailed, and not a single member of my family RSVP'd. On my wedding day, every chair reserved for them stayed painfully empty. I walked down the aisle without my parents, my brother, or my sister. I thought that would be the hardest part. I was wrong. Then one guest posted a 10-second video online with a caption nobody expected. By sunrise, my phone had exploded with thousands of messages. What happened next changed everything. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. I'm also curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let me know in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. My name is Emily, and I was 32 years old when my parents decided that the man I loved wasn't worthy of standing beside me at the altar. His name was Daniel Brooks. He wasn't a millionaire, he wasn't a surgeon, attorney, or tech executive. Daniel worked as the security supervisor for one of the largest corporate office towers in Chicago. He wore a Navy uniform, greeted employees by name, solved problems before they became emergencies, and treated everyone from janitors to CEOs with exactly the same respect. That was the man I fell in love with. My parents saw something completely different. "The man checks ID badges for a living," my mother said the first time she met him. "You have a master's degree. You can do so much better." My father didn't even try to hide his disappointment. "We spent years giving you opportunities," he said. "And this is who you choose?" Daniel never argued. He simply smiled and thanked them for inviting him to dinner, even though everyone at that table knew he wasn't truly welcome. Walking back to the car that evening, I apologized. "I'm so sorry." He squeezed my hand. "Don't apologize for other people's choices." That was Daniel. He never raised his voice, never insulted anyone, never tried to prove himself. He believed character eventually spoke louder than titles. I wished my family believed that too. When we announced our engagement 6 months later, my parents barely congratulated us. Instead, they began calling relatives. I didn't know it at the time. I only noticed what happened afterward. My aunt suddenly had travel plans. My cousin said her children had a soccer tournament. An uncle claimed he had an unavoidable business conference. One by one, every RSVP turned into a polite excuse. At first, I convinced myself it was bad timing. Then my grandmother accidentally called me instead of my mother. "I wish things were different," she whispered sadly. "What do you mean?" A long silence followed. Finally, she sighed. "Your parents told everyone attending the wedding would only encourage your mistake." My heart stopped. "They what?" "They said if the family stayed away, maybe you'd come to your senses before it was too late." The call ended, but I couldn't move. I simply sat on my kitchen floor staring at the wedding invitations we'd spent weeks addressing together. 68 invitations. Not one member of my immediate family planned to come. When Daniel came home that evening, I handed him my phone. He quietly read the messages. Then he looked at me. "They're trying to make you choose." "I already did." His eyes softened. "I'm sorry they're making you pay for it." I expected him to suggest canceling everything. Instead, he took my hand. "Emily, weddings aren't measured by how many people fill the seats. They're measured by the promise 2 people make. If only 5 people believe in us," he smiled. "Then we'll celebrate with 5. His calmness somehow hurt even more, as he deserved so much better than this. The morning of our wedding arrived beneath clear blue skies. Rows of white chairs surrounded the garden ceremony. Most remained painfully empty. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and a few of Daniel's relatives smiled warmly as guests quietly took their seats. The front row reserved for my parents and family stayed completely vacant. When the music began, there was no father waiting to walk beside me, no mother fixing my veil, no brother, no sister. I took one deep breath and walked down the aisle alone. Just before I reached Daniel, I noticed someone near the back quietly raising a phone and recording. It lasted no more than 10 seconds. At the time, I thought it was just another wedding video. I had no idea those 10 seconds would expose the truth my parents had spent months trying to hide. Daniel and I spent the rest of our wedding pretending the empty chairs didn't matter. We laughed with friends, danced beneath strings of white lights, and thanked every guest who had chosen to stand beside us. If anyone noticed the empty front row, they were kind enough not to mention it. By the time we reached our hotel that evening, I had turned off my phone. I didn't want to see another message explaining why someone couldn't make it. The next morning, I switched it back on. It froze almost immediately. More than 300 notifications appeared before I could even unlock the screen. "Emily, are you okay? I just saw this online. Please call me. Your wedding video is everywhere." I stared in confusion. "What wedding video?" Daniel looked over my shoulder. "I don't know. A friend sent me a link. It was the same 10-second clip I'd noticed during the ceremony. The video showed me walking alone toward the altar. The camera slowly turned to Daniel. Instead of looking embarrassed by the nearly empty seats, he smiled at me with tears in his eyes, as though I were the only person in the world. The caption underneath read, "Her entire family boycotted this wedding because the groom is just a security guard. What they ignored says everything about them." The comments were pouring in faster than I could read them. Then something unexpected happened. A man replied beneath the video, "That isn't just a security guard. That's Daniel Brooks." Another comment appeared seconds later. "He stayed with my father for 6 hours after a medical emergency until the ambulance arrived. He never left his side." Then another. "Daniel paid for my son's textbooks after I lost my job. He made me promise never to tell anyone." A retired firefighter wrote, "I worked security with Daniel years ago. He's one of the finest men I've ever met." Within hours, hundreds of stories appeared. A nurse described how Daniel regularly organized blood drives without asking for recognition. A school principal revealed he quietly bought winter coats for students every December. A single mother shared that Daniel had repaired her broken car after work because she couldn't afford a mechanic. None of these stories had ever reached social media before because Daniel had never wanted them to. He had simply helped people, then gone back to work. By afternoon, local news stations had picked up the story. Not because of our wedding, because thousands of strangers were asking the same question. Who is Daniel Brooks? His employer released a statement praising his years of leadership, professionalism, and community service. They announced he had recently received an internal award for mentoring new employees and coordinating emergency response programs across multiple properties. I looked at Daniel in complete disbelief. "You never told me half of this." He smiled sheepishly. "They weren't things I did to remembered." That evening, another surprise arrived. People began posting photos from our reception. I finally recognized several faces I'd assumed were coworkers. One man had been the teenager Daniel once helped find a scholarship. An elderly couple had attended because he'd spent months checking on them after a burglary. A young family had driven 4 hours because Daniel had once saved their daughter during a building evacuation. They weren't guests out of obligation. They were there out of gratitude. Meanwhile, my parents' phones were ringing non-stop. Friends, neighbors, business associates, and even distant relatives had seen the video. Not because anyone attacked my parents, but because people now understood exactly why those empty chairs existed. 3 days later, just after breakfast, someone knocked on our front door. When I opened it, my mother and father were standing there. Neither of them looked prepared for the conversation that was about to change all of our lives forever. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. My mother looked older than she had just 3 days earlier. My father's shoulders, once always straight with confidence, seemed to sag beneath an invisible weight. "Can we come in?" my mother asked quietly. I stepped aside without answering. Daniel greeted them politely. "Good morning." His voice carried no anger, no sarcasm, just simple courtesy, the same courtesy they had never shown him. We sat around our small dining table. The silence stretched until my father finally cleared his throat. "We made a mistake." Those 4 words would have meant everything a week earlier. Now they sounded painfully late. My mother folded her hands together. "We thought we were protecting you." "From what?" I asked calmly. "From settling." I looked toward Daniel. He quietly stirred his coffee, saying nothing. My father sighed. When people started calling us after that video, we realized we didn't know the man you were marrying. I shook my head. No, you never tried to know him. Another silence settled over the room. Finally, my mother whispered, "We judged him by a uniform." Daniel smiled gently. A uniform tells people what someone does. He paused. It doesn't tell them who they are. Neither of my parents could meet his eyes. My father reached into his jacket and placed a white envelope on the table. "We wanted you to have this." Inside was a generous check and a handwritten apology. I slowly closed the envelope and slid it back toward him. "I don't need your money." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Please." "What I needed," I said softly, "was my parents sitting in the front row at my wedding. You can't buy that memory back." She began crying openly. "I watched the video 100 times. "So did I answered. "Every time I reached the beginning, I kept hoping you'd suddenly appear. You never did." Daniel reached over and quietly held my hand. Not once did he interrupt. Not once did he try to make my parents feel worse. That was exactly the kind of man he had always been. A week later, more relatives started calling. One by one, they admitted the truth. Most hadn't skipped the wedding because they disliked Daniel. They stayed home because they believed my parents. Some apologized, some were embarrassed. Others simply asked if they could start over. I told each of them the same thing. Relationships aren't repaired with words. They're rebuilt through consistent actions. Over the following months, a few relatives truly made the effort. Others quietly disappeared from our lives. We accepted both outcomes without bitterness. Nearly a year later, Daniel and I celebrated our first anniversary. This time, the room was full. Not with people who shared our last name, with people who had stood beside us when it mattered. The retired firefighter gave the first toast. The school principal brought flowers. The elderly couple Daniel had once helped insisted on bringing homemade dessert. Looking around the room, I realized something. Family isn't measured by blood. It's measured by who chooses to stand beside you when standing beside you costs something. As everyone laughed together, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "I hope someday we've earned another chance. We're trying." I looked at the screen for a long moment. Then I locked my phone. Not because I hated her, but because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness begins with an apology. Trust is rebuilt one choice at a time. I slipped my phone into my pocket and looked across the table at Daniel. The man my parents once dismissed as just a security guard. The man whose quiet integrity had earned the respect of hundreds of strangers without asking for applause. On my wedding day, I thought I was walking toward an uncertain future. I couldn't have been more wrong. I wasn't walking away from my family. I was walking toward the person who would become the strongest foundation of my life. And looking back now, I would walk that aisle alone 1,000 times if it meant ending up exactly where I am today.